So let me begin by asking the first question. And I'll ask it for brief answers from all three of you. In terms of the European defense industry, what are its most important strengths and its most important weaknesses looked at overall? Ambassador?
Thank you. Well, let me start first with the weaknesses. And by all objective criteria, the European defense industry looks like a sunset business. Amazing. You're looking at your watch. It's a splintered market. It's a splintered policy and legal framework. No single market in that field at all. An array of different differing national regulations, licensing procedures, export control rules, even which sometimes don't even discern between transfers among member states and export to third countries, red tape, duplication, concentration in a few countries, especially those who are a part of the letter of intent, and this, of course, hampers synergies. It hampers scale economies. It hampers R&D. It's also the relatively small size of domestic armament markets. And of course, I would add that this puts us at a disadvantage compared with our American competitors, which can dwell on a huge domestic market, large series, with a $105 billion equipment budget, 4 times the size of European markets. Decrease of expenditure, and on the other hand, I already alluded to that, while European markets are open and welcoming to US manufacturers, their European counterparts often find closed doors when they try to export their defense goods to the United States. And we all have in mind the misfortune of Airbus after it won the tender for the replacement of the air refueling fleet of the US Air Force, which, well, when they won, it prompted a blitz offensive inside the beltway of all the special interest groups that ended up in reverting the decision. And at the end of the day, the contract was handed over to Boeing. So much for fair competition. On the other hand, strengths, well, there's such thing as European defense industry. It exists. It counts. 10, 15 years ago, their names didn't even exist, but today we have such giants as Eurocopter, MBDA, CASA, Airbus, 1 minute, okay, Airbus, Cassidian, all under the umbrella of EADS. We have BAE Systems, we have Finmeccanica, Dassault, Thales, AgustaWestland. We have shipyards, Arianespace, to quote just the big ones. Annual turnover, 55 billion euros, which must make something like $70 billion. It accounts for approximately 30% of world production and employs close to 500,000 people. Among the strengths of this industry, I would mention its capacity to cover almost the whole spectrum of contemporary conventional weaponry, although there are some loopholes which are not adequately developed yet, such as UAVs, strategic airlift, or refueling. But at the end of the day, European armament industry has established itself on the world map of armament procurement. And I'll tell you how.
On that relatively optimistic note, let me turn to Bill.
Sir, that was a great summary. From a competitor's standpoint, when we look at the European market, we see national assets. Those national assets are EADS, BAE, Thales, Finmeccanica, MBDA. So from a competitor's standpoint, when we look at the marketplace, we see companies who are supported by their governments, who have throughput that is more or less guaranteed because there's enormous impact on the economy and jobs if these programs aren't sustained. And so from a competitor standpoint, when we look at our European competitors, we see very powerful engines of the national economies that they represent. We also see enormous partners. We have a 7 subsidiaries, Raytheon does, in Europe, some of them dating back a generation, all of whom have been enormously successful. And so we look at Europe and European industry not only as competitors but as partners as well. If I was to address weaknesses, I would say because of the relatively small niche markets that some European industries play in, they are at some disadvantage. Again, another reason to partner. So I think that's one of the themes that we're hearing here in this conference, how important partnerships are in this new global economy. So.
Got my own here. Thank you.
Peter?
Yes. As a German, I of course regret the acceleration of the program here and the time constraints, which I'm partly responsible for because I have to catch a flight. But I have like 12 pages of note that I won't be able to use. But it's good for you guys. So
Print it in the record.
no, don't. I mean, much of it has been said by my two colleagues here. The greatest strength is because these companies are European. The European member states want their defense and security strategy to reflect the possibility to have the industrial capabilities behind them. They want their own industrial base, still want it, and do their utmost to maintain it for operational sovereignty, but also for security of supply issues. The European defense industry is competitive and has high technology products. The weaknesses have been mentioned as well. It's the fragmentation of the markets in Europe. It's the lack of investment at this point in time. It's also state ownership. 1/4 of European defense industry is still in variable ways owned by a government or by their governments. It's also the lack of size every once in a while. We cannot achieve economies of scale with this. And they also need to undergo a further step of consolidation. And the main obstacle to this, to a fruitful consolidation, often is political. And the latest example, of course, is the failed EADS-BAE merger. Thank you.
You've all mentioned in one way or another by the way, congratulations on the timing. You've all mentioned in one way or another the fragmentation of the market. One has the impression that it's not only the European market is not only a fragmented but a shrinking market. What impact will that have on the industry? Ambassador?
You spoke in the future tense, but I would speak in the past tense. European markets and European defense budgets have gone from 3.5% of GDP in the early 90s to 1.75 as well, even less than that, which means it has been halved. And so the adjustment has already taken place in many respects. And we have had to streamline our own defense industry, our own operational capabilities. We have had to revisit the ways we operate. We have had to adjust to new requirements, operational requirements, and scale down some bloated frameworks to concentrate on core needs. And this is what the French armed forces has undergone over the last 10 years. It was an extremely exacting one, took a high toll, but it did not hamper its basic operational capacities, as we have shown it earlier this year again in Mali. And also it has forced us to be smarter, more efficient, to find ways to do this pooling and sharing. Smart defense, that's what we're doing within NATO. Pooling and sharing, that's what we're doing within the EU. We set up a number of mechanisms which are very pragmatic, efficiency-driven mechanism to share know-how and technology. And there's a program agency called OCCAR, which runs successfully several programs. We have tried to make a better use of scarce resources and develop new systems, and we did that through the European Defence Agency, of which we have a distinguished representative here. One of the programs now in full swing is a MRTT, which stands for multiple role tankers and transport, based on the Airbus A330. And we also have taken the bull by the horns, and we have adopted in 2009 a so-called defense packet consisting in 2 directives aiming at facilitating transfers within the European Union, decreasing in such a way decreasing administrative costs and also prompting competition within that market. But there's some more way to go. So it was a healthy process we went through.
Let me, in your case, sharpen the question a little bit. There's no question that the United States defense budget will go down. There's an issue of how much. I can always have to make the point that if the United States defense budget goes down as much as is projected, both by the requirements of the current law and by sequester, we will be all the way back to the desperate low budget of 2007, which was not exactly a time of massive US weakness. But how do you think the American industry will respond in terms of international sales to the decline in US investments in the next few years?
I think if you look at the reports from all of the major defense industries in the United States, you'll see that the emphasis is now turning more and more towards international, across the board, across the aerospace industry. In the case of Raytheon, we are the largest international, we have the largest export market of all the aerospace industries, nearly 27% pure defense. So that we have 3,000 people in Europe, spread across 7 subsidiaries. So we see international as the growth engine of the corporation going forward. I wouldn't, at some point the domestic market will expose itself and will flatten out, and we'll understand what the sequester means and what budgets going forward may mean. But in the meantime, the international growth path is very robust for Raytheon. I would say, to your earlier question about the declining budgets in Europe and what that might mean, we have found, and I'll use the Thales Raytheon as an example. Thales Raytheon has been an enormously successful joint venture for Raytheon and Thales, and has enabled us to take the products there to 9 other countries around the world. And it's an example of how you take a domestic product and export it outside of its own domestic borders. Again, partnerships and the opportunity to extend your normal markets outside of I would say, extend your traditional markets to markets where you heretofore hadn't been able to penetrate is one way to, in some ways, mitigate the downturn in a domestic market in the economies of Europe.
Yeah, thanks a lot. The ambassador made the case for this already, so I don't need to repeat this. I'd like to pick up on one example that he mentioned, and this is the multi-role tanker, or what we call it, the air-to-air refueling. It's a project that came out of the pooling and sharing activities, which is the European equivalent to the Smart Defense initiative in NATO. And because member states have noticed that it's better to have excellent shares capabilities rather than mediocre capabilities at best of their own, they are about to chip in more than before. And the air-to-air refueling project is one that combines this. And the biggest concern of the European defense industry has been, what is in it for us in the pooling and sharing? At the beginning, they thought it's just about cutting costs, cutting profits, and losing contracts. And that's our collective responsibility in Europe, and especially one for the European Defense Agency, to make the case for this, to show them that this is still a profitable market, and they can prosper in this. So we set up the air-to-air refueling project, launched by France initially, with their intention to buy tankers, in any case, A330. So, but around this, we've built a project that encompasses much more now. For example, to use the existing capabilities in the air-to-air refueling, to use capabilities that are in the pipeline, so to speak. The UK, for example, with their Voyager program, where they already know that they will have excess tanker hours, and they want to sell those, preferably to Europe. We have the example of the A400M, which also can serve as a multi-role tanker. We have Germany with a number of kits that can be fitted, tanker kits that can be fitted in the A400M, and they also know that they will not use them all. So it's a market out there, and there's a fourth pillar for countries who, in addition, because the French contract remains a French contract, are interested in buying capacity of new tankers. I'm not saying new tankers. Not everybody is in it for a new aircraft, but to pool the funds and buy together one. So this shows that there is a future for this. Thank you.
As defense budgets either level off or decline, and we've talked about fragmentation, we've talked about the issue of basically small markets. What do you see as the potential that governments could do at a national level or through the alliance to promote this kind of shared capability, of which the tanker is an example? Of the roads of European defense industry are littered with the bones of projects along those lines. It's good to know some are succeeding. What do you see as the potential? And Peter, I'll let you continue on the theme you started to change the order.
Okay, thank you. I think what's really necessary is that the governments, either individually or collectively, show the defense, and I would enlarge this also to security industry, because it's no longer a defense industry. They have engaged in many more markets that traditionally didn't used to be related to defense. To show them what is in it, show it through investment, but also show it through reliability, I would say, to stick to programs, to launch new programs, and to also to allow the industry to make a profit. Now, this is in some countries, the defense industry is being seen as an industry that should make profits, but it's not like any other or commercial parts of the market where the customer accepts the market's conditions easily. It's different, of course, in the defense market, because you usually have one customer only, so it's a very peculiar market. So this is what I would say in this respect. Also, regarding security industry, I would what we're trying to do is to tap into new ways of funding the procurement here. Also, especially in the area of applications that are not purely military anymore. And we all know that the European Commission has the Horizon 2020 program for R&T and R&D work. And we are looking into possibilities to also fund at least dual-use technologies. The Commission is being very careful in making the point that this is for civilian applications and for dual use, and not necessarily for defense. So, but this discussion has not finished. Another issue is to use European structural funds, for example, in areas where the defense industry consolidates, and you need to cope with the consequences of that. And the third item is that, especially in what the Americans call the homeland security market, where you have your border control and right control and so on, that you also look into applications that can be used in that respect, but also do not necessarily need to be strictly military. And Raytheon is very good at this with a German subsidiary, Anschütz in Kiel, in this area. Thank you.
Ambassador, do you want to comment on the issue of cooperative programs, that is, either agreements among European countries to not duplicate every capability, which does not apply so much to France and Britain, but does apply to many European countries potentially, and also the issue of joint programs which will produce a product which will be bought by more than one country after a process of joint development and joint production.
That's definitely what we're trying to do and to achieve with these tools I just mentioned, OCAR, European Defence Agency, the letter of intent, and we are trying to invite countries with capacity, with some assets to put on the table to join that. And presently, that's what the offer which is on the table for Poland, to involve itself more deeply into that venture. But as you mentioned, cooperation, I think cooperation, it's among Europeans, but it's also with our American friends. And William Schmieder was very laudative about this joint venture you're having with Thales, yes, Raytheon Thales. And so I think this is a goal certainly for us, but unfortunately it's not the common rule. And cooperation is to a certain extent with United States industry, is to a certain extent hampered when our partnerships are unbalanced. When, for example, technology is protected from transfer to allies through a number of procedures and strings attached. And hence, all the unease among the partners of the JSF program, for example, of which France is not, but there are a number of European partners of the JSF. Hence, the troubles Patriot MEADS program and the Eurohawk programs ran into. Another obstacle I would like to emphasize here to that audience is it derives from the extensive use of ITAR regulations by the United States, which have some ambiguous effects. On the one hand, well, the US market is decidedly the most attractive for cutting-edge technology providers, including, of course, the European ones. But on the other hand, their ability to export to third countries is diminished by tedious and lengthy and maybe not always impartial ITAR checks. And this is an inconvenience which a number of European producers circumvent by developing ITAR-free technologies, even for unsophisticated technology, nuts and bolts to provide a caricature, but which of course will increase the costs and decrease the competitiveness of these products. And so what we are looking forward to is of course to cooperate with United States, but with in the American industry without this inconvenience, but we are also very eager to open and open to work with strategic partners which we do not consider as threats, such as India or Brazil, and to offer them real technology transfers, co-development programs with no strings attached, no black boxes, and definitely they appreciate it. I have in mind Brazil with Rafale and also submarines, as well as India.
To raise a slightly more controversial question, and I want to ask all three of you. What is your sense of the degree to which the U.S. uses export control regulations, not either for bona fide concerns about leakage of technology, not normally to the customer, but to third parties, and policy issues such as wishing to have control over where U.S. technology goes ultimately? On the one hand, which I think all countries would recognize as legitimate, and on the other hand, purely for commercial advantage.